The Bay of Pigs War, also known as the Bay of Pigs Invasion, was a failed military invasion of Cuba that took place in April 1961. The operation involved about 1,400 Cuban exiles, supported and funded clandestinely by the United States government, with the goal of overthrowing the communist government of Fidel Castro. The invasion occurred on the southwestern coast of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, Bahia de Cochinos. The invasion was planned initially under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and executed shortly after John F. Kennedy became president. The plan was to use Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA to spark an uprising against Castro. The invasion force landed on April 17, 1961, but faced strong resistance from Castro's troops. The invasion was defeated within 3 days, with over 1,100 of the exiles captured. The failure was a major embarrassment for the U.S., strengthened Castro's position, and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The economic causes of the Bay of Pigs War are primarily linked to deteriorating relations between Cuba and the United States, following the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro. After Castro overthrew the Batista dictatorship in 1959, his government confiscated private property, much of which was owned by American interests. This led to economic retaliation by the U.S., including cutting off sugar purchases from Cuba and imposing a trade embargo on all exports except food and medicine. These economic sanctions aimed to destabilize Castro's government, but pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. The invasion was partly motivated by the U.S. desire to counter the economic and political threat of a communist regime so close to its borders. Key points related to economic causes include nationalization and confiscation of U.S.-owned properties and businesses by Castro's government, U.S. trade sanctions including a ban on Cuban sugar imports, and a general embargo. The economic pressure was intended to weaken Castro's regime and prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. The invasion was supported and financed by the U.S. government to overthrow Castro and reverse the economic shift away from U.S. influence. Castro's growing economic ties with the USSR escalated U.S. intervention plans because they represented a direct challenge to U.S. influence and security interests in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. The key reasons were Castro relied on Soviet economic support to survive the U.S. embargo and economic isolation, including essential subsidies, oil exports, and buying Cuban sugar at above-market prices. This support entrenched Cuba's communist government and made it less vulnerable to U.S. economic pressure. The alliance gave the USSR a strategic foothold just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland, which the U.S. perceived as a significant threat, especially as Cuba's communist regime aligned ideologically and militarily with the Soviet bloc. The Soviet-Cuban economic ties symbolized Cuba's shift from a U.S.-aligned country to a Soviet satellite, intensifying Cold War rivalries and fears of communist expansion in the Americas. This close relationship encouraged the U.S. to adopt more aggressive measures, including supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion, to overthrow Castro and prevent further Soviet penetration so near U.S. borders. The USSR's provision of economic and military assistance to Cuba emboldened Castro's regime politically and militarily, complicating U.S. efforts to isolate or destabilize Cuba. Overall, the economic dependence and support that Castro's Cuba obtained from the USSR intensified the geopolitical stakes, thereby accelerating U.S. plans for intervention as part of a broader Cold War containment strategy. U.S. policymakers viewed Soviet economic support as a direct security threat because it symbolized Soviet expansionism and the bolstering of communist regimes that challenged U.S. influence and security globally. Several factors explain this perception. The Soviet Union's economic aid to countries like Cuba was seen as a means to spread communism and expand Soviet geopolitical influence, undermining U.S. interests and alliances. Economic support helped solidify Soviet-backed regimes, making them more politically and militarily resilient, which made it harder for the U.S. to contain communist expansion. The Cold War strategic framework, particularly after the adoption of policies like NSC 68, framed the Soviet Union as an aggressive adversary seeking global dominance, so any economic support to Allied states was interpreted as part of a broader ideological and military threat. Soviet economic engagement was tied to military aid and alignment, increasing the risk of hostile powers close to U.S. borders or Allied regions, which heightened fears of direct confrontation or proxy wars. Policymakers saw the Soviet economic and military buildup in Allied states as upsetting the balance of power and creating security dilemmas that threatened U.S. national security. Thus, Soviet economic support was not seen in isolation, but as an integral component of Soviet strategic expansion that demanded a strong U.S. response to protect its global interests and national security. What specific Soviet economic programs in Cuba worried U.S. strategists most? The extensive Soviet subsidies and preferential trade agreements, where the USSR purchased about 70% of Cuba's exports, mostly sugar, and supplied approximately 60% of its imports, including vital oil exports. This economic dependency allowed Cuba to withstand U.S. embargo pressures, consolidating a communist regime close to U.S. borders. The Soviet supply of oil and other raw materials to Cuba, sometimes at above-market prices, which helped sustain the Cuban economy despite the U.S. trade embargo. Participation in Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, a Soviet-led economic organization of communist states, which integrated Cuba into the Soviet economic system and isolated it from Western markets. Soviet loans and financial aid that were substantial, amounting to billions of dollars annually, effectively subsidizing the Cuban government to maintain its socialist economy and political alignment with the USSR. Economic planning methods imported from Stalinist models that centralized control over Cuban industry and agriculture, which raised fears in the U.S. of a hardened communist state supported and controlled economically by the Soviets. These programs collectively reinforced Cuba's political and economic survival under Soviet protection, which U.S. strategists saw as a direct extension of Soviet power in the Western Hemisphere and a threat to U.S. national security. The main tactical mistakes made during the Bay of Pigs invasion were loss of surprise and intelligence leaks. Cuban intelligence obtained detailed information about the training camps, invasion plans, ships, and boats, allowing Castro's forces to prepare and reinforce the landing area. There was also infiltration of the exile groups planning the invasion, and the timing of political arrests in Cuba suggested prior knowledge of the attack. This loss of surprise critically undermined the invasion from the start. Poor planning and site selection. The Bay of Pigs was a geographically remote and difficult landing site. The initial plans were rushed and revised hastily after President Kennedy reduced air support and altered landing zones, worsening the invasion prospects. The chosen site was hard to reach and not conducive to sparking a wider uprising. Another reason was the inadequate air support. President Kennedy decided not to provide full U.S. air cover after the invasion began, which severely limited the invading forces' ability to deal with Cuban air attacks and reinforcements. Earlier airstrikes were also reduced in number and effectiveness. Limited local support. The plan assumed that the local Cuban population would rise against Castro once the invasion started, but without adequate propaganda and due to Castro's preemptive arrests of dissidents, this did not happen. Insufficient and poorly equipped forces. The invasion force of about 1,400 Cuban exiles was poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and outnumbered by well-prepared Cuban military units. Lack of full U.S. military involvement. The U.S. government sought to maintain plausible deniability, leaving the invading force without crucial military support, especially after the initial landing. These mistakes collectively led to the quick defeat of the invading force within 3 days, resulting in a major political and military embarrassment for the U.S. government. The Bay of Pigs invasion was significantly impaired by poor logistics and the loss of fuel ships, which affected the invading force's operational capabilities in several ways. The invasion relied on the timely arrival and availability of fuel to keep vehicles and aircraft operational. Lost fuel ships meant critical shortages of fuel at the landing site, limiting the mobility and effectiveness of the ground forces and aircraft involved in support roles. Fuel shortages also affected the ability to maintain air cover and conduct airstrikes effectively, which were already limited by political decisions to restrict U.S. military involvement. Poor logistical planning meant that supply lines were fragile and vulnerable, with inadequate provisions for transporting and distributing materials on the ground. further hampering the movement and resupply of troops. The absence of necessary fuel and supplies contributed to the rapid exhaustion of the invading forces' fighting capabilities, accelerating their defeat. Overall, these logistical failures, especially related to fuel supply, critically weakened the invading Cuban exile force and contributed to the swift collapse of the invasion effort. How did leaks and Cuban intelligence undermine the invasion plan? Leaked information and Cuban intelligence seriously undermined the Bay of Pigs invasion plan by compromising operational secrecy and giving Fidel Castro's forces critical forewarning. Cuban intelligence had penetrated the exile groups and U.S. planning efforts, gaining detailed knowledge of the training camps, operational plans, and timelines before the invasion occurred. This allowed Castro to prepare defenses and arrest suspected collaborators ahead of the attack. The leaks included specifics about landing locations, timing, and the extent of U.S. involvement. Consequently, the Cuban military was ready and able to repel the invasion force quickly. The Cuban government used this intelligence advantage to bolster morale, tighten internal security, and coordinate a swift counterattack, neutralizing the invading force before it could establish a beachhead or spark a larger uprising. The loss of surprise, a vital element in any invasion, was crucial in turning the operation into a fiasco, as it allowed the defenders to mobilize superior forces and resources without being caught off guard. In terms of numbers, the Bay of Pigs invasion involved about 1,500 Cuban exiles trained and financed by the U.S. government launching an invasion of Cuba. The invading force, known as Brigade 2506, faced around 10,000 Cuban troops loyal to Fidel Castro. The invading force suffered about 118 killed and around 360 wounded. Around 1,100 to 1,202 invaders were captured, including wounded. Cuban government casualties were estimated to be about 87 killed, official, but some estimates go to about 1,650 dead and 2,000 wounded. The prisoners were later released in exchange for $53 million worth of food and medicine. The invasion lasted roughly 3 days before failure and surrender of the invaders. The invasion was smaller in scale, but faced a force about 10 times larger and was quickly defeated with heavy losses and imprisonment of most of the invaders. The Bay of Pigs invasion resulted in significant economic outcomes primarily tied to the aftermath of the invasion and Cuba's relations with the United States. The key economic outcomes were: the Cuban government confiscated private property, much owned by U.S. interests, after Castro's rise to power, leading to sharp economic tensions with the U.S. This contributed to the U.S. cutting off sugar purchases from Cuba and imposing an embargo on all exports to Cuba, except food and medicine, starting in 1960 to 1961. After the failed invasion in April 1961, the U.S. prisoners captured during the invasion were released in exchange for $53 million worth of food and medicine, which had an economic impact on humanitarian aid and diplomatic negotiations between the two countries. The invasion failure and subsequent U.S. hostility pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, strengthening economic ties with socialist powers and further distancing Cuba from U.S. economic influence. The U.S. economic embargo and the Cuban government's nationalization policies led to long-term strained trade relations and isolation of Cuba from the Western economic sphere. Exacerbating Cuba's economic challenges, the escalation of U.S.-Cuba trade embargoes, loss of U.S.-owned property, Cuba's strengthened socialist economic alliances, and the economic burden related to the prisoner ransom negotiated after the invasion. These developments had lasting effects on Cuba's economy and Cuba-U.S. economic relations. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 has had long-lasting economic effects that persist in various ways even nowadays. Its failure marked a significant turning point leading to the U.S. embargo on Cuba, which has severely impacted Cuba's economy for decades until today. The embargo, a direct economic measure following the invasion, has cost Cuba hundreds of billions of dollars in lost trade and economic development opportunities, and continues to shape the island's economic conditions. The U.S. embargo, intensified after the invasion, cut off Cuba from its primary trade partner and commercial exchanges with the U.S., which once covered about 80 to 85% of Cuban exports and 60 to 70% of imports. severely hurting Cuba's economy over decades. The embargo has led Cuba to rely heavily on other countries, especially the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, and now BRICS-aligned countries, to sustain its economy. The embargo and economic isolation have contributed to critical shortages, inflation, and economic crises in Cuba, which were exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and economic reforms increasing prices drastically in the last years. Cuba's economic resilience includes parts of a sanctions-proof economy, but inefficiencies and economic hardship remain, partially attributed to the legacy of embargo-induced isolation. The embargo also affects the U.S. economy, costing billions in lost agricultural exports and related jobs. U.S. sectors like agriculture have missed out on business opportunities in Cuba due to ongoing restrictions. U.S. political debates continue about the embargo's costs, with arguments suggesting lifting it could benefit U.S. farmers and create jobs. U.S. economic warfare, including the embargo following the failed invasion, aimed to incapacitate Cuba economically rather than direct military interventions since the Bay of Pigs. Cuba's alignment with countries like Russia, China, and those in BRICS adds a geopolitical layer to the embargo's ongoing economic impact. Cuba was heavily dependent on the United States for trade, with around 80 to 85% of its exports and 60 to 70% of its imports linked to the U.S. market. After the invasion, the U.S. imposed comprehensive sanctions, known as El Bloqueo, which prohibit almost all types of trade and investment with Cuba, severely limiting Cuba's access to the U.S. market and technology, and pressuring other countries to comply as well. In response, Cuba quickly shifted its trade orientation toward the Soviet bloc, and later other allies such as China, Venezuela, and Canada, relying on barter-like exchanges, for example, exchanging sugar and nickel for fuel, equipment, and technology. The embargo and associated restrictions have forced Cuba into a sanctions-resistant economy, with limited trade with Western countries and continued economic isolation from its closest neighbor, the U.S., despite some thawing and partial exemptions allowing limited agricultural exports from the U.S. Cuba's trade patterns remain largely shaped by the embargo's legacy. This ongoing restriction means that Cuba cannot fully reintegrate into regional and global markets in the way it might have before the Bay of Pigs invasion and the embargo. The embargo continues to be a crucial factor in the underdevelopment of the Cuban economy and in the constraints on its trade expansion today. In conclusion, the economic effects of the Bay of Pigs invasion today are most clearly seen in the enduring U.S. embargo that limits Cuba's trade and economic growth significantly. While Cuba has developed some resistance strategies and diversified partnerships, the embargo continues to cause economic hardship on the island and also economic loss in the U.S. agricultural sector. The Bay of Pigs invasion's failure led directly to the U.S. embargo, which remains the primary driver behind Cuba's trade pattern redirection, from heavy reliance on the U.S. toward diversified but restricted trade with politically allied and other international partners, an economic reality that persists into 2025.